Today, I invite you to embark on a journey spanning 8.5 years, a journey through the meticulous process of crafting a 1 to 800 scale model of the American aircraft carrier USS Midway CV-41. It all began on October 20th, 2007, when I had the privilege of traveling from Quebec City, Canada, to San Diego, California, for a work-related trip. During my visit to San Diego, home to the U.S. Navy's second-largest surface ship base, I eagerly seized the chance to explore the USS Midway aircraft carrier, now transformed into a museum. During my museum tour, immersed in the exhibits and captivated by the vessel's storied history, I found myself drawn to the gift shop where I made a pivotal purchase, an ARRI scale model of the USS Midway for approximately $30 US. This acquisition would become the cornerstone of my ambitious project ahead. The ARRI scale model kit I purchased, originally released in 1982, represented one of the best versions of the USS Midway available at the time, with updates reflecting its modernizations up to the late 70s. In contrast, the Revel kit, dating back to 1954, lacks the angled flight deck that later became a defining feature of the Midway class carriers. Fast forward to 2024, and my search for newer kits led me to the Orange Hobby 1700 scale model, meticulously detailed to showcase the USS Midway as it appeared during the Gulf War in 1991, complete with intricate photo-etched parts. However, this kit, while exceptional, comes at a premium price and is challenging to procure. Returning to the ARRI kit, I encountered numerous inaccuracies and missing details that did not align with the USS Midway's configuration following its last major upgrades around 1986. Despite these challenges, given that this was the best kit accessible at the time, I resolved to make the most of it by enhancing and refining its features to better represent the desired era of the aircraft carrier. On April 7, 2008, I had the opportunity to return to San Diego for another work-related trip and embarked on my second visit to the USS Midway. Unlike my initial tour, this time my objective was to meticulously document every aspect of the ship, gathering detailed information to aid in my quest to build a more accurate and comprehensive model. Interestingly, during this visit, I discovered that the gift shop no longer stocked any scale models of the Midway, underscoring the significance of my earlier purchase. On April 21st, 2008, I eagerly began my modeling journey, a rewarding yet enlightening experience that would teach me valuable lessons about the pursuit of perfection and the complexities it can entail. My ambitious goals for the kit included intricate modifications, opening the hangar door to reveal the interior bay, accurately detailing the hangar walls with pipes, and incorporating 2 functioning interior elevators, as well as adding lighting for illumination. On the ship's deck, I aimed to install real metal wires for the arresting cables, raise the jet blast deflectors, and extend the island to include the doghouse structure. For the aircraft, my plans involved drilling out the jet exhausts, folding wings, and enhancing details using photo-etched parts from gold medal models. These parts included 100 naval figures, photo-etched components for U.S. Navy supercarriers, and U.S. Navy supercarrier decals. While the gold medal models parts were technically scaled at 1 to 720, slightly larger than the 1 to 800 scale of the Midway model, I deemed them acceptable given the absence of alternative options and the overall effectiveness they would bring to the project. This endeavor marked the beginning of a meticulous and immersive transformation of the ARRI kit into a true-to-life representation of the USS Midway. To begin working on the interior hangar, I started by creating a template using a piece of paper cut to match the width of the interior hull and shaped to fit the curvature of the ship's inner structure. This paper template served as a guide for cutting a piece of styrene sheet, which required only minor adjustments to achieve a proper fit. The slight trimming needed was likely due to differences in thickness between the paper template and the styrene material. This method allowed me to accurately replicate the hangar walls and begin detailing the interior space of the model. I then added 6 cross-sections to the lower decks as support for the flooring of the hangar. They were placed a few inches apart just to provide structural support and to keep the floor aligned. Now came the tricky part, making accurate interior walls. Fortunately, I was able to find a photo of a diagram of the hangar deck, including the wall layout. I scaled it to the size of the styrene sheet, printed it, cut it out, and drew an outline as a guide for the styrene walls I needed to make. Before I could make walls, I needed to address another detail, which was the addition of tie-downs. These holes with crosses litter the flight deck and hangar bay as a means of securing aircraft and equipment to the ship. I made a template which I printed on paper, taped it to a small sheet of styrene, and drilled out holes with a pin vise hand drill. I then used a 0.5mm pencil and marked the deck with dots using my jig. Once the dots were made, all that remained was to drill 769 small indents, which took me a few hours to complete, as you can imagine. My only regret with this method was not using a clear piece of plastic instead of the white styrene sheet, as it made alignment between sections a bit difficult. Next, I decided to turn my focus on the rudders and propellers, and this is where major errors on ARRI's part became apparent. Firstly, the ARRI's kit came with 4 rudders. However, the Midway only has 2, and they are not even the correct shape. Secondly, the ARRI kit's 4 propellers have 5 blades each. In reality, Midway's 2 exterior propellers have only 4 blades each. Third issue was that the 2 inner propellers were flat in the center, not round as provided. Finally, the fourth and most challenging fix was the hull's keel, which splits in 2 toward the stern, where the 2 inner shafts connect. In the model, there is only one keel on the center. By June 26, 2008, I was able to correct all the errors in the keel using lots of reference photos. With the keel fixed, I was able to return my focus back to the interior of the hull. I drilled out 2 holes to pass the wiring for the interior lighting, but did not want to pass the wiring immediately so that they would not be in the way. I needed a method to ensure the wires would go to the correct place and not get stuck beneath the hangar floor once I was ready to install the lighting. My ingenious solution was to use a simple straw as a guide, which was cut at an angle, and this worked brilliantly. Before I could glue the hangar floor to the hull, I needed to build 2 interior elevators, which were just simple boxes of styrene. I kept them simple as from the exterior of the model, only a small hole was perceivable. I then proceeded to glue the floor to the hull and build tiny sections of walls following the guides I had previously drawn. It's incredible how much detail I was able to incorporate simply by referencing the diagram of the hangar. Having that visual guide made all the difference, allowing me to capture nuances I would have otherwise overlooked. Without the photo for reference, the result would likely have been a much simpler representation, with just a few plain, flat walls lacking character. I'm genuinely thrilled with how it turned out. It's a transformation that truly stands out. After a lot of hesitation and research, I decided to paint the hangar deck Tamiya NATO Black, XF69. Why the hesitation? Well, as with any aircraft carrier, the state of the deck will change over time from a flat black when refreshed to a light gray color during extensive use. I finally decided to go with the cleaner look of the black deck. I first started by painting the walls Tamiya Flat White XF2, which was the easy part. To airbrush the NATO black, I first had to mask the walls, because on the real ship, the black goes up the wall several feet. It was not easy to mask the walls due to the tiny size of just 11 millimeters high, but the extra attention to detail was worth the trouble. I then added decals to simulate the red and yellow checkered lines around the interior hangar doors, which can be seen from the exterior hangar door. Next, I decided to paint the exterior hull twice. The first time I used Tamiya XF7 flat red, which looked like a red primer and was simply hideous. After doing some research and discovering that ship's anti-fouling, which is what is used to coat the bottom of vessels to prevent sea life such as algae and mollusks from attaching themselves to the hull, varies a lot in color due to several factors, such as exposure to seawater and the elements. I decided to use my best judgment and went with Tamiya X7 Red, which I felt looked better. Now for a little electronics fun. I was initially going to use white LEDs, but I found out that they make a spotlight effect, which is not what I was looking for. Searching for an alternate solution, I stumbled upon a post in Fine Scale Modelers forum where some people used an electroluminescent strip lamp to light up the engines of the Star Wars Millennium Falcon. Laminated in plastic, flexible, and thin like a piece of paper, it can be cut into almost any shape as long as the leads are exposed, which makes this product very interesting. I therefore ordered a 10-inch by 3-inch strip on eBay, which was roughly the same dimensions as the inner hanger. On August 13th, 2008, I performed a light test and was extremely satisfied with the results and could not have asked for anything better. Before I could complete the inner hanger, I was missing something: aircraft. The ARRI kit came with a lot of aircraft, too many to be honest, as some never flew on the Midway, or in the example of the F-14s included, was a one-off incident only involving 2 Tomcats. I therefore narrowed it down to using 26 aircraft, which includes F-4S Phantoms, A-7E Corsair IIs, A-6E Intruders, E-2C Hawkeyes, EA-6B Prowlers, and SH-3H Sea Kings. While finishing off the A-7 Corsairs, I realized that the kit did not come with enough insignias to cover all the aircraft. The 26 aircraft required 104 insignias, and the ARRI kit only has 68. I therefore ordered from the Starfighter Decals website a decal sheet containing 432 insignias, as well as 245 Navy and Marines decals for a mere $7 Canadian. Not bad. Within a week, I got the decals and the jets look great. I also added photo-etched refueling probes where applicable. Lots of detail for such a small aircraft, barely the size of a penny. By May 25th of 2009, I started work on the main flight deck. Just like in the inner hangar floor, I needed to drill out a few holes to represent the anchor points. However, I decided to change the technique with the lessons I learned and printed a large transparent label that I applied to the top of the deck, loaded with dots for me to drill out with a pin vise. This technique also allowed me to avoid drilling out details that I wanted to preserve. By August 14th, I completed drilling the holes. I could only do small sessions of 10 to 15 minutes before I would get cramps in my hand. Sometimes it could be quite painful. Over a period of almost 12 weeks, I drilled 2,092 holes, which took me over 7 hours to complete. While the work was very long, the results were definitely worth it. With the drilling out of the way, I moved my attention to replacing the plastic nets with the finely detailed photo-etched ones I procured from Gold Medal Model's U.S. Navy Supercarrier set. As previously mentioned, not a perfect fit as it is designed to fit a wide variety of carriers at a slightly larger 1 to 720 scale versus this kit's 1 to 800 size. However, I was able to adapt enough pieces to make it work. This was the first time I worked with photo-etched parts, and I found it to be a bit tricky, but the level of detail it provided outweighed the cons of working with such delicate material. On September 11th, 2009, I turned 30 years old and celebrated with family in my hometown of Trois-Rivières, which translates to 3 rivers in English. My wife had asked me what kind of cake I wanted, and having seen some photos of aircraft carrier cakes while researching the USS Midway, I had asked for one. I was a bit doubtful that I would get my request, but my wife actually went ahead and had her friend make one for me. It looked great and tasted good too. In August, I painted the hull with Tamiya X7 Red. However, I found it to be too flashy. I decided to try Model Master Acrylic Flat, Insignia Red FS331136, which proved to be a much better choice in color. I then masked the hull with Tamiya tape to proceed with the next step in painting the remainder of the hull gray. Unfortunately, I masked it too high and had to redo it because I did not leave enough space for the black line that will be painted between the red and gray sections. Using painter's tape to cover the large portion of the hull and protect the red, I applied Tamiya XF19 Sky Gray to the upper half. Lastly, using more Tamiya masking tape, I was able to paint out the center black line with Tamiya XF1 Flat Black. Next, I returned inside the hangar as I needed to raise the height of the gray lower section of the walls. I applied masking tape that I meticulously measured to ensure everything was level, then applied the paint. Once dry, I added random vertical pipes on the wall to provide more detail, then painted them. I figured it would be easier to do it this way than to have paint bleed behind the tape with all those protruding pipes. While just a simple and easy to implement detail, it made a huge difference to the overall look. For various reasons, the Midway project was put aside and remained dormant for almost 3 years. For my son Casey's 6th birthday, I got him a Revell Snap-Tight F-14 Tomcat. This should be a nice project to work on together during the summer holidays. When I looked at the box art, I noticed it had the USS Midway in the background. This reminded me that I got to get back to working on that Midway kit. I decided to resume work by detailing the two Sikorsky SH-3 Sea King helicopters. One detail that impressed me was replacing the thick plastic rotors with photo-etched ones. Wow, what a difference. I estimate that each helicopter took about an hour to paint and detail each. By mid-November, I completed the two E-2 Hawkeyes, and just like the Sea Kings, I added photo-etched propellers from gold medal models and decals from Starfighter decals. I plan to fold the wings of one of the two aircraft to display it in a parked area while the other one will be ready to launch on a catapult. Once again, the Midway kit was put aside until September 2015, another 3 years due to other projects. This time, my wife got me a display case as a birthday gift. I had been trying to find a solution of how to display the Midway properly, and this was the best that I could come up with that was affordable at around 50 Canadian dollars. By January 15th, 2016, I resumed work and decided to get everything ready to install the hull onto the base. I was trying to find a way to center the ship's hull, and the best technique I found was to use a laser level. With the holes marked, I used a drill, and after a bit of filing, the brass stands fit perfectly in place. I then proceeded to cut some square molding I purchased to raise the base so that I could incorporate a 9-volt battery, switch, and wiring for the lighting of the hangar area. Finally, I installed decorative molding, glued it to the base, and spray painted everything flat black. I then performed a quick test laying the ship on the brass to see if everything looked correct before continuing, which it did. By the end of January, I started work on the anchors. The version supplied with the kit was very simple and thick, so I opted to use the ones included in the photo-etched sheets provided by gold medal models, U.S. Navy supercarriers, due to the higher level of detail. In February of 2016, I started work on the elevators. Unfortunately, I forgot to drill the holes in them like the flight deck. The good news was that I still had my template document and transparent stickers, so I printed some out and drilled away with a pin vise. I then spray painted the top to match the flight deck and hand painted the underneath. Finally, I installed the photo-etched safety net. I now set my focus on the stern where I installed what is now called the Fantail Cafe at the USS Midway Museum. I included several scratch-built parts based on reference photos and photo-etched railings. By mid-February, I was ready to finally install the hull to the base. To help secure the ship, I decided to create an L bracket out of a piece of coat hanger, and I attached a threaded rod using some super glue. Since I was not sure how the ship was to be attached to the base several years ago, I had glued 2 straws to guide the lighting wiring, but now one of them needed to be removed. Using tweezers, a small screwdriver, and a lot of patience, I was able to free the small straw from the glue to make space for the L bracket. On the 22nd of February, I finally got to install the Midway on its base, a major milestone for this project. I used a plastic level to ensure that everything was straight and tightened the nut to secure the custom L bracket in place from underneath via the brass posts in the stern section. The bow brass post will be glued in place as a hole needs to remain for the lighting wire. Now it was time to place the aircraft inside the hangar bay. The bulk of the aircraft in the hangar are the 6 A-7 Corsairs, which are accompanied by 3 A-6 Intruders and a Marine Corps EA-6 Prowler. In mid-March, I glued the 4 custom propellers on the Midway. I placed them the same way as seen in a reference photo that I found while the carrier was in dry dock at Yokosuka, Japan in 1980. Next, it was time to assign some sailors to the hangar deck, and boy did it sure assist in creating scale in relation to the aircraft. I was surprised by the effect that the sailors gave. Helped show depth and made the ship feel more alive. I have read in a lot of magazine articles about adding people to a scene to help provide a reference of scale, and this was definitely proof. The photo-etched personnel were painted using toothpicks, which despite the miniature size was a simple and fun task. On April 3rd, 2016, I started wiring the ship in preparation for lighting the hangar deck. Unfortunately, I underestimated the width of the two wires and did not drill a large enough hole underneath the hull. Let's just say it was a very tight fit, but after a lot of fiddling around and a bit of cursing, I managed to pull the wires through. I then injected hot glue underneath the base so that everything would stay in place. A few days later, I realized that the wires would not pass behind the wall of the hangar. I tried shaving the inside of the hull, but it was pretty evident that this was not going to work. So I snuck the wires back underneath the hangar deck and with some tweezers managed to pull it out from underneath at the bow of the ship. I also read an article in Fine-Scale Modeler where a division was added in the ship's bow so that light would not go through where the anchor chains would pass. I found this to be a good idea, so I glued a small piece of styrene and gave it a quick coat of gray paint. A few days later, with everything hooked up, I plugged a 9-volt battery in the base and flipped the switch. From a simple idea I had when I bought this kit, the moment that I had been waiting years for had finally come to realization. I am very proud of what I have achieved. After the test, I then proceeded to glue the electroluminescent light to the top of the hull using microcrystal clear glue so that it would not fog up the transparent plastic. I added a few Tamiya bottles for weight and temporarily taped them while it was drying. For the next few weeks, I painted the sides of the deck Tamiya XF19 Sky Gray along with the white lifeboats. After verifying some reference photos, I decided to also paint the walkways around the deck the same color. While the actual ship walkway floor appears to be the same color as the deck, I decided to paint it the same sky gray color due to the complexity and very small scale. Masking the walls within the walkway at 1/800 scale just was not realistic. Using a Staedtler pigment liner 0.05, very fine, I highlighted all the elevators, catapults, and jet blast deflectors to give them more depth. A simple and easy trick I discovered. By mid-May, I was painting the number 41 on the bow of the flight deck. Painting the number 1 was very simple using a rectangle mask. I worked quite a bit to mask the number 4, which required a lot more tape. I decided to paint as much as possible the deck details instead of using the decals to give it a better finish. It took 5 coats of white paint, but the number 41 looks great now. Time to get started on the angled deck. Fun fact, the USS Midway's deck was modified in the late 1960s to accommodate larger jets such as the F-111B Aardvark, which was in development and had a 13-degree offset from the center line compared to 9 degrees on a supercarrier. To this day, the Midway can still lay claim to having the most drastic offset of any angled flight deck in the world. As for the F-111B, it was cancelled and the F-14 Tomcat took its place and was never used on the Midway except in one instance where a pair of F-14s landed in an emergency. I proceeded to mask and paint the runway. One of the reasons I decided to paint instead of using the decals was the fact that the ARRI Kit decals have yellowed and don't look that great. I researched and felt confident I could make this look good. The key is to just break everything down into smaller tasks using lots of masking tape. I started with the main white lines, which required a crazy amount of masking tape and precision application. Once the white paint dried, I used reference photos, Adobe Photoshop, and with Excel, I was able to calculate the length of each yellow dash at a scale of 1 to 800, which came to 19 millimeters or about 3/4 of an inch in length, with the beginning and end dash being slightly off. I started by using a ruler on a plain piece of paper to mark the areas that were to be painted yellow, then applied vertical tape on top of the existing horizontal tape that was used to mask the white lines. I then applied 3 coats of Tamiya XF 3 flat yellow, allowing a 30-minute dry time between coats, and removed all the masking tape. Now this model is starting to look like a carrier. However, I was not finished yet, as my next challenge was to make a second set of parallel lines on the runway that were slightly thicker than the first set and more inwards. The first outer line is about 1 millimeter, whereas the second inner line is about 2 millimeters. Lining up the masking tape properly was no easy task at this scale. With 5 coats of Tamiya XF 2 flat white applied, I removed the masking tape from the inner lines of the runway. Each addition of detail makes this ship look more amazing. Painting the white dashes on the outer lines of the runway took some careful planning to figure out the proper steps, but by breaking everything down, it became simple to paint a complex paint layout. Basically, I was able to calculate that from the end of the runway facing the bow of the carrier, I needed to paint a 4 mm or 5/32 inch white square between each outer line every 25 mm or 63/64 inch, while making sure the lines were parallel with the stern of the ship. Now all that was left was to mask and paint the runway beginning and end sections. I have started to regret installing the photo-etched security nets around the ship, as I keep touching them by accident and now I need to apply paint. I decided to remove the sections at the end of the runway and will reinstall them later on. By June 5th, I completed painting the ends of the runway. Masking to paint the yellow dashes was daunting, to say the least, as a high level of precision was needed to make sure everything was straight and evenly spaced. For the yellow line hanging from the stern, called a flight deck foul line. I tried applying Tamiya masking tape, but there was not enough surface area for it to adhere properly. I ended up using a toothpick and eyeballing it. After examining several photos of the Midway, I decided to paint the white deck launch arrow. I found it odd, but after noticing on a freshly painted Midway photo that it had the arrow, and I suspect it probably gets worn out pretty quickly, which is why it is not seen often, I decided to add it since there are already raised panel lines on the deck of the model, and I like to add as much detail as possible. I also noticed that in these photos, the whole contour of the deck has a white border. With lots of masking tape and patience, I proceeded to mask the deck. By June 10th, everything was done and it looked very sharp. A flight deck wouldn't be complete without a couple of arresting cables. I found some sort of metal jewelry wiring I purchased several years ago that had a texture identical to a real cable at this scale. Using a few drops of super glue, I placed the cables on the deck and they looked very realistic. After long debating if I replace the 5-inch cannons with missile launchers, I decided to keep them as I could not find any aftermarket items in this scale, nor could I scratch build them due to the small size despite some initial efforts. Assembly was fairly simple as the cannons were composed of just 2 halves. 3 coats of sky gray later and a dot of flat black on the barrel end, they were ready for installation. The first one placed in the ship's bow had no issues, but the next one in the stern starboard side was too tall and could not fit in under the main deck to my surprise, so I removed about 1 mm of the cannon turret height. The last one located in the stern port side had no issues. Despite wanting to have the missiles, the cannons look very good and still will represent the Midway as she would have appeared in the early 80s. Next, I moved on to the elevators, specifically the one that will be in the lowered position, located on the starboard side near the stern. I added the red and yellow warning decals along the contour. I then used a new technique of applying microsole and microset setting solutions to help it adhere better to the surface. Afterward, I proceeded to do the same with the other 2 elevated elevators. After noticing on some Midway reference photos that the V-lines and runway security lines are composed of red and white dashes, I decided to redo the V-lines using white decal printer paper. I used Adobe Photoshop to create a red and white dash line that is 1 mm wide and each dash is 3.3 millimeters long. To remove the existing white V-lines, I opened an old can of Tamiya TS 48 gunship gray spray paint, using a can opener to extract its contents, as I could not use it to spray such a small area without risking damaging the surrounding, and a bottled version does not exist in this color. Unfortunately again, my third attempt at creating the V-line still did not satisfy me, and despite starting to become a bit sick of this part of the project, I decided to once again redo it. So for my fourth attempt at creating the V-lines plus the runway security lines, I decided to return to my custom printed decal sheet, but this time cut them with my X-Acto with more precision to get very straight lines. The results look good, so this will be it, finally. Depending on the reference photos, the Midway has a yellow E painted on its deck during the 80s. The style of the E appears to change slightly every time the deck was repainted, which initially was a bit of a headache as to how I should paint it. In the end, I chose a thicker style which was easier to mask using Tamiya tape. I really like how this turned out and am glad that the letter was simple to mask and paint. While the kit has a nice island structure, it was not accurate to the Midway I visited. In the very early 80s, the island was extended with what was nicknamed the doghouse. I used various types of styrene sheets to reproduce this structure using reference photos I had taken on trips to San Diego. Using gold medal models photo-etched aftermarket parts, I built the radar tower to be eventually installed onto the doghouse structure of the island. The fence on the top was a particular challenge and I ended up doing it twice. Next, I built a photo-etched radar for the tower. Finally, I assembled the largest radar on the Midway, composed of 3 different photo-etched parts, glued together with micro crystal clear. What an improvement over the kit's plastic radar. The last part needed for the island is the main radar mast. After checking a lot of reference photos, it appears that the kit's mast will hardly need any modifications to my surprise. The only exception was a small radar that will be replaced with an improved photo-etched one. I completed assembling the island minus the photo-etched parts. It's been a hard couple of weeks as I had to constantly verify reference photos to ensure accuracy as best as possible. It sure is a challenge to be historically accurate with a kit that is far from it. Once satisfied, I gave the island a coat of Tamiya Fine Primer. Afterwards, I coated it with Tamiya AS2 Light Gray. When all was dry, I proceeded to paint the lower portion of the island with Tamiya XF85 Rubber Black. A few days later, I proceeded to paint the white 41 on each side of the island. I debated if I should add the black outline around the numbers due to the small size. I also fear making a mistake which would be hard to correct since I used spray paint and not bottled. I asked my 10-year-old son Casey for his opinion, and after showing him reference photos, he said it would definitely be much better with the outline. I therefore proceeded with a Staedtler pigment liner 0.05 pen and made the markings with not too much difficulty. It sure made those numbers pop out. I am very pleased with the results and enjoy having my son's opinion in the construction of this model. Fast forward a few days, I glued the photo-etched railings to the island, which added a nice touch of detail that was easy to apply. The tough part will be to paint them, especially the forward one which is nestled tightly against the main mast. I use Gold Medal Models U.S. Navy Super Carrier decal set to decorate the island's various awards that the Midway has received as well as other fine details. At one point, a white letter E on the port side came off and was lost due to me manipulating the island. Fortunately, the Gold Medal Models U.S. Navy Supercarrier decals set include several aircraft carrier names. I was able to find a near identical letter E from the decal sheet. The Beware of Jet Blast props and rotors decal was tricky as the props was initially propellers, so I trimmed the decal, removing the L's from propellers. Lastly, I decided to paint 8 red dots to represent the enemy aircraft shot down by Midway's air wings, as no such decals were provided. I have now completed the island and installed it on the deck of the Midway. While certain parts were difficult to assemble and the modifications challenging at times, I am glad to have reached this milestone. Now setting my focus back on the hull, I installed the only elevator in the lowered position and the Midway's crane. I used a Staedtler pigment liner 0.05 pen for the black markings, since drilling out the holes through the crane was not an option due to the small scale. It sure looks great when the interior lights are turned on. Next, I glued the 2 little white boats found at the ship's stern. I originally wanted to include phototech rudders that I had, but the scale did not work out, so I installed the ones provided with the kit. I also installed the optical landing system, which is composed of lots of lights with various colors. I wanted to paint individual dots per bulb, but it was just not feasible, and I ended up having to contempt with painting lines. Using a simple piece of styrene, carefully cut into a precise rectangular shape, I created and added a jet blast deflector positioned in its raised configuration. This small yet impactful addition enhances the realism of the flight deck. Moving on, I decided to install the various antennas that are positioned around the deck of the Midway, 16 in all. I had a sign of relief when I was able to place the plastic case over the base and confirm that there was still some space left. Finally, I reached another milestone with the whole deck now populated with planes, jets, and helicopters that I had painted several years earlier. The photo-etched parts, such as the propellers, refueling probes, along with the tiny decals, make the Midway's deck much more interesting to look at. But more detail was still needed. I hesitated to include the photo-etched yellow tow bars, but finally decided to include them, which turned out to be a lot easier to install than I had initially imagined. The hardest part was applying the 3 coats of yellow paint to the parts. I sometimes wonder how I managed to do it, but I painted and detailed the minuscule tow tractors used to pull the aircraft on the deck of the Midway. Using photo-etched parts, I replaced the boom of the Tilly crane and added a photo-etched pulley. I used the same metal cable for the arresting cables on the deck as a cable between the boom and the base of the crane. Finally, using a steady hand and some toothpicks, I painted the wheels and windows. Over the next few days, I added the flight deck personnel to the flight deck. I am not sure how many were added, but with all the colored vests, they stick out and help add perspective to the scale of the other aircraft and the ship itself. With the build almost complete, I removed the protective plastic I had placed on the base of the case several months ago and proceeded to glue a bronze medallion on the acrylic case on the left side, and to the right, the USS Midway patch. Both items were purchased on the USS Midway, just like the scale model back when I visited her in San Diego on October 20th, 2007. On the evening of Wednesday, November 16th, 2016, I placed the last piece of this kit by installing the Midway decal to the stern. Since the kit did not come with such a decal, I used Adobe Photoshop and a font called Airborne to print one onto Expert's Choice Decal Clear Decal film. I intentionally saved this step for last, as I found it to be fitting for a ship build. After beginning construction on April 21st, 2008, and completing the project on November 16th, 2016, I am thrilled to announce that the scale model of the USS Midway is finally finished. This endeavor spanned 8 years, 6 months, and 26 days, totaling 171 hours and 39 minutes of dedicated work. The time I recorded does not include the extensive research invested along the way. Throughout this journey, I navigated various life changes and challenges, including the joyous arrivals of my second son, Terry, and my third son, Andy. Additionally, I experienced milestones such as moving into a new house and overcoming a significant back injury that temporarily prevented me from working my day job for 6 months. Constructing the USS Midway has been a profound learning experience for me in the realm of scale model building. I've discovered that striving for perfection can sometimes detract from the enjoyment of this hobby, leading me to pursue a more artistic approach to modeling with future projects. While aiming for exacting detail can be challenging and occasionally overwhelming, I've found greater satisfaction in embracing creativity and expressing my passion through my work. Ultimately, I took immense pride in crafting a highly detailed scale model of a ship that holds personal significance, especially one that I had the privilege of visiting and exploring firsthand. This project has not only honed my modeling skills, but has also deepened my appreciation for the craftsmanship and artistry involved in recreating historical and meaningful subjects in miniature form. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you taking the time to check out my video. I hope you enjoyed it, perhaps learned something new, or even inspired you. Until next time, keep on scale modeling.